All right, so I'm going to record the event, so just give me 1 second, and I will do that. So really today is an AMA. It's a Ask Me Anything Q&A. What do you want to know? What do you want to hear about permaculture? It's such a term that is thrown around nowadays, especially around social media and in face of climate change and social disorder, just unrest and all that. So it's really great to be able to discuss it, talk about it, because it really is a philosophical approach to many of these different problems that we face. Before I get too far into it, I just want to do a quick acknowledgement that I am coming to you live today from Anishinaabe unceded territory. And what that specifically means to each and every person is based on your understanding of what unceded means. And this isn't an attempt to heal past wounds, but instead to acknowledge that wounds exist and wounds are still being made today under the name of the Canadian colonial machine that is still taking new lands in Wet'suwet'en territory and other territories. So if you're not so sure about what's going on with Indigenous lands, with reconciliation, with any of this, I ask you just to go and do some rabbit hole YouTube search. There's some great videos that we will be able to share with you that can help you on this journey. But it's just important as people who are here today on unceded land to begin addressing these issues rather than just acknowledging that we are here. So that's us attempting to go beyond the land acknowledgement, saying that we're just here on unceded land and doing something about it. So the other reconciliation that we are implementing and we have implemented over the last year is that we offer discounts to members, Black, Indigenous, people of color, to have 50% off on all of our online course content and 25% off on 4 seats for every one of our in-person courses. So this is in order to help balance the discrepancies that are the result of colonialism and all the other injustices. We also give 1% of our profits if we make profits to the land defender organizations in the Wet'suwet'en territory. So that's another attempt that we do to go beyond just acknowledging that we're on unceded land. So we're trying to make steps forward and trying to improve. Obviously, we're going to always have lessons to learn. So there'll be a full introduction yet to permaculture as well on the, I didn't catch the date, I think it's the 18th. Yeah, it is Tuesday the 18th from 7:30 p.m. till 9. Thank you, son. So if you wanted to know more about details about permaculture, then that's a great place to go and get more into it. But what we'll do now is we'll start with some of your questions, if you have questions. And if not, I can also just start with introducing, why is permaculture relevant today? So if anyone has a specific question, I can start with that. If not, I'll jump right in.
Bonnie had a question about what we could do what we could do in urban areas,
Yeah.
small things in an apartment or whatever to introduce permaculture into one's lives. But I'm sure you can start with why permaculture is so relevant and then carry on with that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Meg. That's really important. I think it's too easy to always think of the big picture and feel left out of the everyday steps, especially in an urban setting. So for me, permaculture is so relevant today because it isn't a gardening technique, because it isn't a farming technique. Really, it isn't even a technique. It's a philosophy of understanding how we approach problems and solutions in the world. Permaculture being a worldview that's based in the observation of nature, we look at the patterns of nature that have existed for 4.9 billion years and have been going through all kinds of different tests of time, whether it's, magmatic evolution of the earth or asteroids or whatever. So there's a lot of information and learning that we can gain and glean from how species have survived, how ecosystems have thrived, and how they've been developing unique symbiotic relationships together to coexist and co-thrive in their evolution. So really, permaculture is about observing all of that and then boiling it down to how do we apply that to our everyday lives. It's so important today because as a species that is awakening to a global threat that isn't based on nationality, that isn't based on what borders you are behind and what, status of wealth that we have in the world. It's really about, we are a living organism on this earth today, and the earth is in need. In many ways, the need of the earth today for us is to be able to hold our species, but it's not really a threat to the planet. The planet has gone through worse and probably will go through worse. So really what we're looking at is, how do we dialogue? How do we learn to dance again with the earth in a way that brings back the abundance that allowed us as a species to be here in the first place? So, how does that look like? What does it mean to learn how to dance with the earth, with nature, with other species, other civilizations? What I mean by that dance is that, ideally when we're dancing, we're not stepping on each other's toes, right? And that there's some kind of fluidity there, some kind of a give and take in that dialogue. So that's why I like to say the word dance, because many of us have some kind of reference to that. Whereas a lot of what we've been doing today, with the way that we engage in extracting resources, the way that we build homes, the way that we build even care facilities, we are very much in a linear extractive kind of mentality. We take and we forget about what taking is going to cause. And even when we give, we forget about the repercussions of that giving. So today's world is a world of need, of pain, of panic in our human species in many different ways. And it's also a world of awakening, where finally, with this ability right now to stream, to the stars and back to your living rooms, so that we can all discuss these philosophical conundrums that we face together, is quite an important and empowering place to be. So as a species that's awakening, as people that are here and that are interested in doing different and doing better, there's everything from, how do we capture carbon at home, because the carbon in the atmosphere is too high at the moment? How do we reduce harm on ourselves and our family members, so that we as individuals who have accepted the challenge to rise up are stronger as a community, stronger as a people, stronger as a family? How do we look at ways of dealing with each other? Because most of the time, it's not the projects or the financing that are the biggest hurdles, but it's the people in those systems. And how do we engage with each other, especially more and more being, behind the camera and the screen in my office alone? How do we ensure that as a people we grow together stronger and build networks and communities where we can work with people who we don't necessarily agree with, which is healthy, which is important, right? If we just lock ourselves into the YouTube algorithm of all the videos that you see are the videos that you like, right? Well, then you don't pop outside that bubble, and we get into this echo chamber, as they call it, where you just see and hear the things that you know and that you believe. And so it is important to learn communication styles and dialogue with people in a way that we can be in a conversation with someone that we wholly disagree with, and at least learn from them, and at least hear what they have to say, and let it challenge our own opinions, and learn from that and what it brings up in us. So I think there's a lot of aspects of this that are healing the land, that are healing our food, that are bringing health back to our organism, our human body, that are bringing communication and openness back to our species, our communities, our families, our friendships. And a lot of that is evident in nature. Communication is something that I think is so complicated with words. I'm learning so more and more with my 14-month son, who is starting to learn some sign language for more, and all done, and all of these things, right? Where we have so much complexity in our language that we forget to observe the body language of others. When you see a dog for the first time, there's no language, it's all body language. So we have, in favor of complex linguistic skills, we've given away a lot of our understanding of behaviors, and not just with dogs and squirrels and 15-month-old babies, but with ecosystems. How does an ecosystem react to digging a hole in the ground? How does an ecosystem react to bringing a wetland back that was there many, many, many years ago and now isn't? How does a garden react to pollinator species being planted? These are body languages, or I'm sure there's another word for it, but they are ways that the earth is responding or warning us about our actions. And I think it's important to open our observation skills, which is the fundamental first principle in permaculture, is to observe and interact with nature so that we can better understand not only what is happening that's wrong with the earth, but to see also the benefits. Because so often in face of global climate change, sea level rise, mass migrations, pandemic, food shortages, all of this, we get lost in how making that mulch bed in your backyard or growing some food on your balcony is really going to have change. And the butterfly effect is a great concept, but to visualize it is incredibly difficult. So to be able to see, that one balcony garden that you were able to get going, and to then taste the tomatoes that came from that plant, and then to have the question of in your mind, why don't my grocery store tomatoes taste like this? Just that process right there is a butterfly effect that has huge impact, because you as a consumer who normally bought those tomatoes unquestioningly and now has tasted real tomato with real sweet and that oomph of flavor that comes from something that's homegrown, begins to question the process of growing our food in industrial farms and having tomatoes and strawberries all year round and all of these things. And just that will then come up in your conversations, and will come up in your purchasing choices. It will come up in all of that. So when I have people who tell me, like, this little lime tree who's going dormant beside me here is never going to produce enough limes for even a few mojitos, why are you growing it? Well, the concept of growing a lime tree, watching it bloom, watching the difficulties that it has, picking that one lime, it begins to bring perspective to the lime and citrus production industry that is globally just accepted today. And so to me, all of these elements are not about providing 100% self-sufficiency. You'll never grow enough tomatoes on a balcony for your needs, but you will grow enough tomatoes to begin a journey of redefining your relationship to food. And redefining our relationship to food is redefining our relationship to the earth, because fundamentally that's the base language, food and water, that we have, and air, to the earth. So when we start to ask questions, well, this year my tomatoes were not as sweet as last year. Why is that? And then we start to get into the soil health and understanding that the entire soil ecosystem is what's providing us with this nutrient, with this health, with this, all of these different benefits. So there's so much that we can glean from even just that simple experience of picking the first tomato that you grew, even on that little balcony bin in the middle of a city. So for me, there's so much more than this for what permaculture is and why is it so relevant today. But to me, it's about redefining what it means to be human today on Earth in these circumstances, and how we want to be human with each other, and be human with other species, and be human with the Earth, and to share those learnings that we have gained throughout our life to others. So I'm going to leave it there. We can obviously delve into many versions of that rabbit hole. What do you guys think about that? We got Francois joining us. Sorry, go ahead.
I tend to agree. I find that just there's so much available information now too, more and more, which is really great. The awareness is coming, and
yeah, and I think
I like that, the small gestures. You can do small gestures. Like, I live in an apartment building, and I said to a small block, and I said to my landlord, you don't mind if I do stuff outside? No. So I'm slowly introducing things, but I hadn't thought about the impact of giving, and it's trying to be aware of, are you introducing things that will be destructive, that will kick other plants out? Like, what does that look like as well, right? So
what are that will kick other plants out? Can you just recap that?
Well, it's sort of, if you introduce something, it can like you were saying about it has effects on other things.
Yeah.
But will it bring harm? You know, and it's
Yeah.
like you see there's a history of people bringing in decorative plants and things like that, and then you find, you know, Japanese knotwoods taking over the Laurentians, or you know, there's these other effects, and it's to try to be aware of those things, and it's not always easy to tell, but and I like the fact there's more and more quote scientific information coming out that backs out what a lot of people have known for a very long time, right? About the root systems of trees talking to each other. I mean, there's so much really interesting information out there now that's quite proven, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas people have suspected this for a very long time. So
yeah, I'm really happy because, you know, it's one thing to say, well, you know, the oral histories of you know, First Nations of North America, of the Aborigines, of many different cultures around the world have talked about this for so long. So it's kind of silly that we had to spend all this time studying it, but it's not, in a way. There's an elder out in Nova Scotia. He talks about two-eyed seeing, and the idea that there is the land-based traditional way of seeing the world, but there's also the scientific basis, and neither one replace the other. They in fact combine their wisdoms, and they help each other to better elaborate what they're trying to share and what they're trying to learn. And you know, as a teacher who's been teaching since 2007, it's it's about language, right? And if I'm speaking to people who have a biology degree, then I switch over to some of the biological terms that we've learned in biology. If I speak with somebody who's in, you know, I'm translating through Spanish to another language, well, then we go to very base terms of understanding. If I'm dealing with a farmer, it's very different as well. So whether you're using traditional terminologies, if you know them or not, or scientific ones, or colloquial ones, it's about making sure that we are able to explain and discuss things in many different languages. And I don't mean languages as in English and French, but like abilities, levels of communication, right? I had just taken some notes. One thing, Son, could you drop a link to the book called The Hidden Life of Trees, which is a really amazing book. There's also The Hidden Life of Animals, which I ended up finding because it was the same author, that really talk about this dialogue beneath the soil among these plants. So those are two really great resources. And then I want to dive into knotweed, because you dropped a knotweed bomb there that I wanna diffuse. So, but before I do that, Japanese knotweed, you had mentioned it, so we're gonna side tangent on that just for a second. Before I do that, it looks like actually our live Facebook and YouTube is working, because we've got some chats, comments coming in. So just to let you guys know out there, that we are here for you as well. If you have questions, just drop them in the chat and we will add them to our Q&A. And also, can anyone out there clarify whether you can hear the other participants' questions, or would you like me to repeat those as they ask them to us out loud? So Monique, as we wait for those other answers, you had mentioned knotweed and Japanese knotweed, and how many times when we bring in plants, there's so much of a ripple effect when we bring things into an ecosystem. So the Japanese knotweed is one, yes, that was brought in as an ornamental plant that is now classified as an invasive plant. And what's interesting, so the book that I want everyone to, before you just leave the stream after what I say, I want you to look at the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species, A Permaculture Perspective. This is an amazing step back, because first of all, we have to understand, as we talk about observation of the earth, as we talk about looking at, as we look at, you know, how we engage as a people, we have to understand that we come with baggage, right? We have so much baggage based on our learning, on our experience, where we came from, all of these things. And so to understand that when we classify a plant, can you all hear my son on the drum? No, okay. It's good theme music as we get a little more intense. If you think about where we come from in terms of these plants, we have an understanding of what is right and wrong, and it's very, very profound impact when we as humans delineate something as black or white, as good or bad, as right or wrong. And we have such a tendency, and I don't know Why? I think maybe it's because it's clearer for our brains to understand, is this a poisonous snake or not? Is this an edible berry or not? But I think it's gotten out of control in our minds, where we tend to lump everything into right or wrong, right? And so it's really important that we don't do that too quickly, and that we really, if we catch ourselves doing that, we step back and retake a new perspective. So with knotweed and invasive species, what I wanted to bring into the perspective is, first of all, everything is indigenous to Earth that we know on Earth, right? Everything is a native species of Earth, except for some spores, I think, of mushrooms that they're not sure whether they originated on Earth or originated on other planets and arrived to Earth. So beyond that and that rabbit hole, we can think about everything being here on Earth as in transient, as in flux. So there's one of the species I did a study on when I was in grade 12. It was like, you had to do these biology intensive studies. And it was called the dragon tree of the Isle of Socotra. And it was mainly found on the Isle of Socotra. The youngest of these trees is 300 years old, which means for the last 300 years, there hasn't been a seed that has germinated from this species. Effectively, it's an extinct species. It's just that the members that remain are still holding on. So they have no reproductive cycle. And this is largely due to the fact that they are a species that evolved before mammals existed on the earth. They were of the vegetative realm, of the mushroom realm of colonizing the earth. So they were the first species, some of the first waves of species that came out, not first, but they were here before we had dogs and cats and goats and bears and all the other mammals that are out there. And what happens is that their seedlings really don't handle the goats and the deer and all these other creatures. So they actually, if you look at biogeographically, they used to be all across Asia, all across Europe, all across northern Africa, all through the areas surrounding Australia and in these islands. But now they are just found on the island of Socotra, because they are a species that is going out of, they're going extinct, right? But they are transitioning through a period when there were no mammals. Does that mean, like, to protect this species, we should eliminate all mammals from all of those continents to let this species come back to what we say is the normal state, or the state that it should be existing at? So this is where I want to play the dangerous game, right? It's what we are deciding as this is the state of the earth. This is the state of the ecosystem. If we try and maintain it at that, we are breaking all the fundamental laws of nature, because a forest will eventually, turn into, may have a landslide and turn into a lake. You may have a field that turns into a forest. You may have a lake that fills in with sediment that becomes a swamp, that becomes a field, that becomes a forest, that becomes a jungle that then has a landslide that becomes a swamp all over again. And there is no stable ecosystems. There is no stable reality on Earth, except in our lifetime, we do see it as a stable thing. So to bring this back to Earth here, or ground level with knotweed, if we look at Japanese knotweed that was brought here as a species for ornamental purposes, we see it now taking over more and more and more throughout northern US, southern Canada, and it's really beginning to spread more and more north. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the range at which this species spreads is the same range at which the black-legged tick is spreading. So they actually are both species that exist in the same ecosystem. And what's happening is that the climates are shifting. And so as it gets warmer and warmer, the species that were now tolerant and abundant in northern US are entering into southern Canada. We're just going to mute some of the other microphones while we go. Okay. Oh, San, are you? So I see you're on the YouTube. Are you on the Facebook as well? Okay, amazing. Oh, no, you're not. Okay, because there's a Francois. I'll get your question.
I'm on YouTube, not on Facebook, but I'm trying to get on.
Okay. I just see one question on Facebook that we'll add to the queue, Francois. So don't worry. So what I wanted to say about that was that what's interesting is these two species are parallel. Now you dig more into it and actually find out that the black-legged tick is the carrier of Lyme disease, which is a really problematic illness because there is no actual treatment for it. You can treat it very early on and prevent the severity of it, but there's no real long-term treatments, except the root of the knotweed plant, when pulverized and made into a medicine, is actually a traditional treatment for Lyme disease. So all of a sudden, this one plant that we are, because my main problem with the idea of vilifying something like knotweed is that we then give ourselves permission to put in thousands of dollars worth of excavator work to destroy the plant, or put Roundup on it, which I've had many organic people, eco people, permaculture people, clients say, we do everything organic except the poison ivy and the knotweed. We use Roundup on those. Roundup is a proven carcinogen. It's a proven carcinogen that will last for tens of thousands of years. So pretty sure the knotweed will be gone and the Roundup will still be there killing organisms, giving them cancer. So there's a real issue with us permitting ourselves to do harm in the name of preserving an ecosystem that is in transition, right? All the time anyway. And so I think a lot of what is important is to step back and look at why and how these species are invading. If you look at a large list of species, of invasive species in the US and Canada, there's a huge amount of them that are actually repair species, or what we call by repair species, or species that have a very fast growth cycle. So if you look at Japanese knotweed, it grows up very, very big, but it also dies back and puts huge amounts of organic matter on the soil, where all of the soils that it's invading are areas that are devoid of organic matter, like on the side of the road, and they're erosion prone areas, which this plant is also really good at stabilizing erosion. If we look at, there's a autumn olive. Autumn olive is one that a lot of people have put in the blacklist, right? Is a nitrogen fixing shrub that is drought tolerant and that is able to thrive in conditions where the soil has been destroyed. So the more that we destroy the soil by tilling all the time to produce agricultural profits and food, the more that we open the door for this species to be invasive. So some of the dialogue of invasive species is that we are actually creating conditions in an ecosystem that are so destroyed and so poor drained, erosion prone, low in nitrogen that, guess what? The black locust, which is going to stabilize erosion, fix nitrogen, and help drainage, is going to thrive. And then we call it an invasive species and spend tons of money trying to remove it, where we could instead take a step back. And I don't also mean that I want Japanese knotweed everywhere, but we can identify the cause that is allowing it to thrive. If destroyed soil that has low carbon and low nitrogen is causing all these unwanted plants to grow everywhere, well, then why don't we bring some carbon back to the soil and bring back a nitrogen cycle that's healthy, that was there before we tilled it up to grow potatoes and corn. So some of the perspective is, I'm just talking about using it as an observation that we can then step even further back to understand some of the core elements that are allowing this species to be invasive. Because really, what is an invasive species? It's a species that has the ability to thrive in a specific condition or climate setting, right? And so even poison ivy, invasive species that I really don't like. But there are, if you look at the forests in North America, now we're starting to get them back, but the wild boars were a very, very long time completely hunted out. And the wild boar seems to love poison ivy. It's one of the first plants it will eat when it arrives at an area. But it doesn't just eat the leaves, it actually digs the roots out and destroys it. So, do we have a poison ivy problem, or do we have a destabilization in the population of the wild boar that we don't like because they bulldoze through our gardens and rip up our apple trees, and because they're pretty intense species, right? So there's a big rabbit hole that we can get further into, but I really recommend the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species, A Permaculture Perspective. It can kind of delve further into that rabbit hole. I just wanted to address the question that we have coming in on Facebook. Water in town, is it better to use rainwater or special filter for rainwater that can help grow a better healthy veg in town, in the cities? Francois, so to address water, rainwater used to be one of the purest forms of water. But now, as it rains down, it filters through the clouds. So if we had pristine clouds, like you're in the countryside, even depending on the countryside, it's not the case, but you will pick up particulates from the air that aren't ideal. It's really not that big of a deal, but I'm always of the adage where if I can easily reduce harm, I don't care that there isn't a toxic amount of pollution in my rainwater, but that little bit that's always there that I can avoid easily by putting a carbon filter on or by putting a small filter on, I do it. I do this anyway in all of our systems, and if you're not able to do that by putting filtration on your watering systems, then the other way of doing it is looking at how does an ecosystem naturally filter out these toxins, and it does so through living soil. Right? There is either bacteria or fungi that are going to denature and destroy these chemicals if they are if the fungi are going to do it, it's because of their hydrocarbons. And if they're heavy metals, which is the other major contaminant or thing that we're worried about, well, then by balancing the pH of the soil, we don't have the acidity that would allow those heavy metals to be soluble and then be in our tomatoes. So by putting mulch on the ground, we balance pH. And by putting mulch on the ground, we feed the mushrooms and the mycelium. So by bringing back the carbon material to our soils, we are preventing the potential contamination of our food from any toxins that come in through the rain, that come in through bad soil that we bought or were gifted, or whatever that may be finding its way into the soil. So as a preventative in all of our systems, yeah, if we can put a filter in, we do, but we also ensure that all of our soils are healthy, living soils that have the natural ability to defend and denature and decontaminate soils as they grow. Let's see if there's some other questions. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Monique. You asked about things we can do in the urban areas, and then Goostronics also asked specifically about vertical growing systems and how are they good. So I'm going to kind of combine some of these questions, and then Francois, we'll get back to your other question just in a second. So in the urban settings, I think it's really important to start looking at the unused spaces. In Europe, they have all these underground tunnels that were from a rail system that are now defunct. And there's one company that started growing mushrooms in them, that started, obviously getting some good ventilation, but then setting them up to produce mushrooms, which require a very, very low amount of radiation or light. And they produce a very high protein food on waste materials. So very, very good food supply that is then produced in an area that was completely abandoned. If we think about a lot of the warehouses, there's so many warehouses in urban settings that were overbuilt or that are no longer suitable, that can be converted into vertical growing situations, vertical farms. We obviously have things like the rooftop gardens in Lufa that are interesting and that are the beginning of a new understanding of cultivation of foods in the city. But I think the indoor vertical farming is an aspect that we are going to have to contend with. So what's crucial to know about these is that, first of all, you're in contact with plastic, as you are PVC pipes, which have chloride in them, which are to kill bacteria, to keep them clean. There is, different phthalates and BPA and all these other things in the plastics as we are growing in hydroponic systems. So how do we curtail that? How do we ensure that our food is getting the least amount of that contamination as possible? Well, we also need to then look at how do we make sure that those plants are able to be the healthiest as possible. So instead of just going with a general hydroponic system, what we do is observe all the limiting factors, right? If you're going to grow even on your balcony, the limiting factors to the health of that plant are the soil and the water and the light. So using light that is artificially produced is obviously got a certain amount of cost. We've got a lot of LED options and compact fluorescent options that are low energy, but there's also some really interesting stuff out there using fiber optic cables and a satellite dish that goes on the roof, and it concentrates the sun to these fiber optic cables, and then you have a sun lamp in your basement that's actually bringing sunlight from outside. So those are some really interesting uses, right? And yeah, there's the creation of the products, but you're getting real sun on those plants, which can be a lot better than LED or other broad spectrum grow lights. So that's one thing. The soil is another one. So very often in hydroponics, we use soilless media. And this can be a big problem because then we are responsible to put only to put in the nutrients that the plants will need to grow. Whether you're putting in your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassiums, or more than that is really up to you and your grow style. There's going to be some need for some boron, some copper, some molybdenum, some iron, all of these different things. And if we start to try and control all of that, it's hubris to think that we're not going to miss something, right? It's a bit, we've got to be a bit more humble with our understanding of growing systems, and to know that instead, if I can grow indoors in a vertical grow mechanism that has a living soil mechanism where we have the all of the different um, all of the different strata of life in the soil with the thousands, in 1 teaspoon of living soil we have 600 million organisms. I think I always get these numbers wrong. It's either that or more than that. It's 600 billion or 600 million. I can't remember. So if you want to know, watch the documentary Kiss the Ground on Netflix. It's also really, really good. But basically, the amount of life that we find in a teaspoon of soil is absolutely over the top. And to think that we can replace all the jobs of all those bacteria, all those arthropods, all those mites, all those fungi is really, it's a problem. And so when we do a hydroponic system and we are in control of all the nutrients that flow to these plants, that can be a big issue that will cause stress and weakness in a plant. And a stressed or weak plant can actually be more susceptible to contamination, because plants, as humans, as other species, have these mechanisms to detoxify and to decontaminate their tissue. If they're not at prime health, then they won't have the ability to avoid those toxins or avoid those problem contaminants. So there's a lot of importance in looking at vertical grow systems or hydroponic grow systems and bringing them to the next level, which first step is aquaponics. So connecting the growing of fish with the growing of plants, and the waste of the fish, which is actually a problem when you're growing an aquaculture system. It will kill them through causing a pH imbalance and an ammonia imbalance. It actually goes through the plants and then feeds the plants with much more than nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, because it's literally the manure of the fish that are going into that. I've also seen people using vermiponics, which is a combination of hydroponics and aquaponics and vermiculture worms. So instead, they don't have a soilless media. They have a media that has like a coconut coir, and the bio sludge that comes from the fish, the yuck in the bottom of the tank, it gets caught up in this coconut coir, which is a high carbon material. And then the worms live in this layer and they are eating and breaking down that material. So we're adding layers of ecosystem elements back to that system. And the best that I've seen altogether is actually using, having filtration beds that will filter out the water before it goes to the fish, and then using the aquaculture water as irrigation for not hydroponic but indoor grow systems. So you're using full soil medium with a mulch, organic matter mulch layer, and using drip irrigation coming from the aquaculture. And then the water that goes to the fish is going through large vegetable beds that can do the soilless filtration so that the fish are healthier. So it's not, the problem with all of this is that every time we add a layer of the ecosystem back to a controlled system, it becomes more complicated in the initial setup. But over time, the actual maintenance of it is less and less of a problem, and the quality of what we're creating is actually much better. So there's a lot of rabbit hole that you can go into for vertical systems and how we're doing them, but there's a lot that can be really interesting in looking at the use of space, right? There is in Singapore, which is the kind of the poster child of the world for biophilic cities, which are cities that have integrated nature back into them. There's an article about these office buildings, and in the conference room, they have this really cool light structure above them with all these plants hanging around it. But all of those plants are edible greens. And they go to the cafeteria, and there's somebody who comes in after the conference, to tidy up the coffee cups and whatever. And they also go and trim off any of the veggies that are ready to go to the cafeteria that then get served at lunch, maybe even at that same conference room. So there's some really interesting integrations of vertical, not just as grow areas separate from living areas, but integrating the two together. I've got only a few little plants behind me, but I do have more than my annual supply of turmeric coming from the pots behind me. I've got 1 or 2 limes, just enough to get a taste. I've got, ginger that starts to be producing an interesting volume. And you're never going to produce massive amounts, but you can supplement some of the basic needs even in a small setting like this. But if we then apply that to every room in our home, every room in our office building, every storage facility that is defunct, having some kind of a modular grow up that takes over while it's not being used, think of the spaces that we have in our world that are heated and have lights on all the time, that are not even growing base plants that filter our air. Right. So there's a lot of different ways that we can integrate vertical, and not even just about growing food. Right. We did a project with the Cadillac Fairview, which is the big company, profit money company that owns all the shopping malls. So we did one with the marketing firm Bleu Blanc Rouge, who went and put in a big kiosk in the Rideau Center. There was over 600 plants in this kiosk and all these different benches. And when you got close to the plants, the bird song would be playing in the background. So it was not an edible experience. It wasn't about producing food, but these hallways have lights on them 24 hours a day. And so we set up a system that was self-irrigated, that brought all of the needs to these plants. And what we ended up seeing was these hordes of people who would go there for their lunch and just spend an hour sitting in the plants, reading a book, listening to birdsong. Now, I don't care how many calories of lettuce or spinach we didn't produce in that vertical grow system, but talk to me about the psychological impact that we had on those people who maybe don't ever get out of the city. What about the psychological impact on people who, who are just trying to rush through life and trying to get the bills paid and everything else? And that's an experience they're allowed to have on their lunch now because we have brought plants into the hallway at the mall. What harm is it bringing to the hallway? So there's some interesting aspects here that go beyond food production and nutrient production. And this is where biophilic design is talking about integrating life back into our living spaces. I've got my mom's voice forever in my mind telling me, go play outside, because as kids, we had 72 acres in the backyard. We had 3 forts to manage, and I had my own little garden, and I had all these things to do outside. And that, for me, was so formative in bringing me an understanding and appreciation to nature that I didn't actually even have until I got to the city. And I realized how much I loved that experience. But we can do that without having to go outside. If the resulting way of getting nature and natural experiences is that on the weekend, like, you're rushing out of the city to rent a chalet to go and experience hikes in the woods and things like that, like, this is a stress. It costs money. It takes time. You're caught in that traffic flux of people leaving the city and coming back to the city. We need to look at ways that we can bring life into our own living spaces and integrate life into our every breath, into our every moment. And if you start reading some of these books, like The Hidden Life of Trees, there's a couple books on I'm blanking on it right now. It's a Japanese technique where you go into the woods and you have deep breathing. Anyway, someone drop it in the chat. Forest breathing. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay. So so this concept, they've done a lot of studies and shown that it's not just psychological. It's not just like, oh, there's fresh air. There's actually positive ions that are released by the soil organisms, that are released by the plants, that are then actually having a mental and physical effect on your body. And so to just say that, oh, well, I'll go out to the park, or I'll go out to the garden, or I'll go, is not a solution that works for us anymore as a species that lives, more than 70% of our population in cities. We need to do what Singapore is doing and start blurring the lines between the park and the office. And it needs to be a jungle where we live. We are a species that has evolved for thousands, tens of thousands of years with hundreds of other species. To think that I can exist even in here with my 25 plants and my 1 cat is not enough, right? Psychologically and mentally and health-wise in our mind. So in the city, I think a lot of what we can do is not just massive scale food production, but it's also redesigning the city to be a healthy mental space, a healthy physical space, emotional space, community space. You know, the wonder that comes when somebody sees one of these little terrariums that I have in the background here. Inside there's insects crawling around and mushrooms growing and mosses and all this. It's a world into itself. But the awe that I've seen, because I personally love them. It's my own way of staying sane in the middle of the winter, is building these little terrariums. But to see the awe in the children and in other adults who are like, oh my God, this is such an amazing little world, that has ripple effects on so many things that we can't even think about. And if at minimum, each and every one of us had one of these terrariums sitting on our desk, whether it's at home or at the office, just that, taking a second when you're having stressful email or whatever, taking a second and losing yourself in that little world, opening it up and smelling the forest. It actually smells like a forest when you have a balanced ecosystem. So these are huge effects that can be beyond fighting climate change in a big perspective, but they're fighting them at home in the everyday mental, social, and emotional health of our people who are coming and stepping up to the game of fighting climate change, right? So I think there's so much more than just planting out thousands of trees and sequestering tons and tons and tons of carbon. If that drains you and you can't do it again, then it was a fail. So at home, if we've built an ecosystem of friends, of food, of green space, of internal green space that will fuel us to be able to do again and again and again these steps towards a better future, then that's really an important thing to do. Sorry, I know that there's a long tangent, so I want to get some of these other questions. Son, are there any questions on Facebook or on YouTube? I can't seem to scroll down the feed on the stream.
Yes, I'm about to read it to you. Sage is a wonder plant for some places. I live in a camper and go some growing out on my deck now with 10 centimeters of snow on top. Okay, so it's not a question, but a comment and a good one.
Yeah. So even the winter doesn't kill some things, right? One of my favorites is the mallows. I've seen in January, I've seen like snowbanks that are kind of up against a brick wall and it melts away, and there's like a blossom, a purple mallow blossom right there that was under the snow the whole time. And it's just like there's some things like that so even in our designs, I have crocuses and other ornamentals that people are like, oh, I didn't know these are edible. It's like they're not. They're there because in March, end of March, beginning of April, I need some color. I need signs of life. Green grass is great. All the new shoots are great, but I need some purples and some pinks in my garden because it just reminds me that we're coming out of this. So there's some elements like that yeah, if you have sage bushes or we have a lot of concept of cleaning up the garden at the end of the year. But what I really love is when the snow is down thick and you've got these little sticks of mullein and echinacea or whatever else sticking out of that mound of snow. And then you see this little flock of chickadees come over and pin the stalk down and all have a little feeding frenzy, knocking the seeds off. And you realize that if I had cleaned that garden, I would have, removed this glorious feast for them for this one day. And so I think there's so much in these little things, like seeing that sage that's peeking up and thriving through the snow, or that mallow that's reminding you that the color will come back, or the crocus that is signaling the warmer days to come. I think there's a lot of that we can embrace in our designs too, that are not just like how many tons of apples we can produce and how many tons of walnuts we can produce. Son?
Yes, just the next question was from Nadia. What are good greens and herbs to grow indoors in our Canadian winters, even if we don't have grow lights?
Yeah, so that all depends. This is going to be the answer that you hate me saying, is that it depends, because it depends on how much sunlight you have. It depends on where you are in the climate. The further you go north, the angle of sun changes completely. So the intensity of the UV is different and all these things. So the first thing I say is try them out. You try out different herbs. Don't go and buy a bunch before fall, but if you can get cuttings from people and put them in, and try them out, you'll notice that some do really well. So, for example, you can't really barely see it. Anyway, in the back here, somewhere back here, there's a lemongrass, right? Lemongrass isn't one that survives our winter. It does really well in our summer, but it survives our winter indoors. And I have more, I don't need a ton of lemongrass, but I don't have to buy lemongrass anymore ever again. So I have the lemongrass that I need. I had thyme. Thyme needs a lot of light, but it was doing really well. But I had put it in a pretty ceramic pot on a nice wooden shelf, and it looked really pretty. And it wasn't one of my self-watering plants with living soil and mulch, and it dried out and died. And this is where it's when you start mixing plants, you have to really be a bit. I prefer just to set everything up to be completely self-watering and autonomous. Like this pot here with the burlap, it has a reservoir underneath that holds water enough for 3 weeks in the summer, so it's probably like 4 or 5 weeks in the winter. So I basically never water it. It has a 2-inch layer of mate leaves, green tea leaves, or black tea leaves that are crushed up on the surface. It has a colony of vermicomposting worms that live inside of it that are cycling this organic matter. And most importantly, they are catching any root rot and eating it before it spreads. 80% of the houseplants that die are because of root rot. There was a study done in the UK, and that's because of overwatering or because it sits in a drip tray of water. When you've so this living ecosystem here, I don't have to really worry about it. Every once in a while, I'm like, oh, I haven't watered that in a few months. I should check on it. But that is a problem for me because all the other plants that are not self-watering don't do so well because I'm used to having these automated systems. So this little ornamental pot that my thyme was in, I was using the green onion as a cue. When it wilts a little bit, it's like, okay, it's time to water, because it was up high on a shelf, and you have to stick your finger in 2 knuckles deep to check for watering, right? So I'd seen the green onions still green, and then a week later, the thyme was dead. The green onions were still green. But I guess the green onions handle drought way better than the thyme does. So mixing plants isn't always a great idea unless you really get into checking them. Other herbs that do really well are the ones that you're going to grow up and cut often. So you can grow things like cilantro and stuff like that, because they're going to have real trouble when they start to try and get to be a big plant and produce flower and seed, because there's not enough light most of the time wherever you are in Canada, if you're in Canada. But as kind of like a microgreen, so you could seed a pot of them with a bunch of seeds, and when they come up and there's only a few little leaves, you can be pruning those leaves off and harvesting them, and they don't ever get to a state where they're really start to show the stress of the lack of sun, right? So that's one thing you can do with the herbs. I found basil to be really hard. It doesn't do well without the intense heat and the UV of the sun. Anyone else have other ideas about herbs that do well indoors without grow lights? Because when you add grow lights, it can be a game changer. But when you don't have them, yeah.
You have mentioned micro sprouts. I think lentils tend to grow into micro sprouts very easily. And ponsla, I think, has some chives. Is that what it is?
Those are green onions. Yeah.
Green onions.
Yeah. So the green onion, whenever I eat them now, you save the last inch, and then you just stick it in water to refresh the roots and put it in the ground. Yeah, exactly. This is, Francois, this is why my thyme died, because I had about 8 of these in the same pot as the thyme, and they were just loving it. They were super happy. And so I didn't think that they needed water. The thyme was like dying, basically. So there's a bunch of those things. I actually have a leek that's this tall from the same thing. I took 1-inch cutting of the bottom of the leek and rerouted it, and it has grown up to be about this tall. Now, you're not going to get a production of leeks. You're not going to get, but I have some leek greens that I can trim that are fresh. So there's some things like that. But of the like classic herbs, a lot of those, like especially if it's sage, rosemary does well indoors if you can get it a good amount of sun. But anything with fuzzy leaf or light colored green leaf, they're usually tolerant of really high heat. So, you can put it if you put it too close to the window, you get all the cold from the window too, right? So you get more sun, but less heat. So there's a lot of those things to consider.
I don't know
Let's.
if you wanted to return on Confor's question about whether it's better to use rainwater or a special filter for rainwater. He said he wanted to return on that.
Yeah. So, well, in the garden, I use a very simple inline filter that I buy that I plug into the hose. Basically, I have a timer on all my garden systems that waters automatically a drip line, and it goes through then a filter for that. You can do this on a rain barrel too. So you can have your rain barrel, the spout goes to a little timer, the timer irrigates at night, and then goes through this little filter. The problem with that is that once you add filters to the line, if you don't have enough gravity, it slows down the flow, and your drip hoses are not going to work as well if you're not using soaker hose. So you have to use soaker hose first of all. The other thing is that you can have your irrigation lines going into a thick layer of mulch. And that mulch, if you inoculate it specifically with beneficial mushrooms like the wine cap stropharia, then this can be something that's going to be a colony of these mushrooms right there to denature any toxins that are coming in. Most of the particulate, the pollution in the air, I mean, there won't be that much heavy metal pollution from the air because we're no longer burning like leaded fuels and things like that. A lot of that is found in the ground from older buildings. But the air pollution, I believe most of it will be able to be filtered out through that living soil. The other thing to consider too is that if you are worried about toxicity in your soil or heavy metals and you're not sure, whether it's safe, there's studies that have shown that plants that produce fruits have a tendency to accumulate all the toxins into their green leaves. So like a tomato plant, if it's grown in toxic soil, the tomatoes themselves will be fine and the leaves will have accumulated toxins. Not that we eat the leaves of the tomato, but it has a natural defense. So if you think that you are in risky soil or water situation, don't grow kale, spinach, Swiss chard, and lettuce. You grow tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and things like that that are fruiting species. So that's a kind of fail safe as well. We have one client in Montreal where we redid the entire yard to be deep mulch, passive irrigation. But when we were digging the swales, I was pulling out looked like slag iron from an old forge and like chunks of cement and coal from when they had coal fireplaces, like really bad risk of contamination. So we're going to test next year after we've gone through a full year of soil decontamination and see, but also the majority of all the plants that are in her yard are all fruits and nuts and berries. Just in case we can't decontaminate safely enough that soil, the foods that are growing there are safe to eat. The thing I do also for water though is the soil has a much better way of protecting itself than we do. Drinking rainwater or drinking tap water, I highly recommend that you get a filter. We build our own filters. We sell them as well, but they are basically a ceramic filter that filters out viruses and bacteria, most viruses. And then they have a charcoal filter, activated charcoal, that filters out the remaining of the toxins. And then no matter your water source, you have safe water. We moved to Chelsea this year, and we have a well, and we had a fecal outbreak, and our water was yellow. And going through this filter, we had crystal clear water down below. And so we, just by us automatically having this filter, even when we don't need it most of the time, it ended up protecting us all from having some bad E. coli. So that's something I highly recommend. You can buy them online, you can build them yourself, and we may be eventually having a workshop on how to do that. Yeah, son?
Goosetronic asks, are mice and rats considered vermin in permaculture? Do they need to be controlled with growing urban areas?
Yeah, so vermin, I mean, the term in and of itself comes with some baggage, right? Mice and rats are responding to certain circumstances in this city. Now, those are scavenger species, just like raccoons, just like foxes, just like skunks. They actually have a nose for dead animals and rotting food. And so when we have like a compost bin in your backyard that you're not composting properly because you didn't realize that you need actually twice as much carbon as you need compost material or kitchen scraps, and it starts to smell bad, then yeah, you're going to have problems with these different species. The other thing we have to think about is that if we live in a city where we've designed a perfect habitat for mice and rats, but yet we have no perfect habitat for foxes and badgers and hawks and owls, well, then the control mechanism that would normally take care of this rat and mice are not present, right? So the one thing we need to start doing is designing our cities when we look at problems like this, to create more habitat for the predators that will balance these problematic species. But if the species is getting into your home and eating your food and potentially a vector for bacteria or disease, then yeah, it is a problem. I'm not a holist where I'm just like protect all life. We have mouse traps, and when they came running in because the cold came, we removed them from our home. So you do have to have these kind of considerations, but the question is, right away, oh well, why are the mouse coming indoors? Is there not enough field grasses? Because normally they'll love living underneath all the field grasses when there's a big snowpack on top of them. So the question doesn't just stop there at getting rid of the problem, but then why is that problem affecting me is where we go next. So if it's in an urban area, the garbage collection systems are the main reasons why we have a proliferation of raccoons, mice, and rats, is because we are fermenting our food waste into the perfect, buffet for these species. And then we have like sewers and basements and attics for them to thrive in. So it's kind of, we built exactly that perfect paradise for them. So if we want to not have that many of them in our cities, we need to make sure that all organic waste is diverted into compost or biogas systems, and that we aren't producing massive amounts of food for them. Let me know, Goose, if that didn't answer your question. So Tara has a question. Is there a safe way of growing edible food and medicinal plants if your land is adjacent to the pesticide-ridden soy fields? Yes. Or should that be avoided? Yeah, Tara. So the first thing you need to think about is the vectors of contamination. So you have land that has corn or soy or anything that is got Roundup on it or other herbicides or pesticides. How do you deal with them? Well, you think about how do they get into your property, right? That's what I mean by vectors of contamination. So water and wind. When they're spraying, there's wind. When it rains, it's leaching up a lot of that chemical and washing it. If you're downhill from them, then you need to, and I don't want to should on anyone, but it's highly recommended that you create a physical barrier, a deep ditch at the uppermost portion of your property that is not a ditch that drains, but a ditch that's level, which we call a swale in permaculture. Fill it full of wood chips. Put in specifically pearl oyster mushrooms if you can get them, and if not, put in wine cap stropharia mushrooms, because the mycelium will denature the hydrocarbon that is Roundup. They'll break it, and denature means it doesn't just absorb it, it breaks apart the hydrogen carbon molecules and turns them into their elemental form. So it actually destroys it. And what you do is you have all of your influx of contaminated water arrive in that biofiltration swale, is what we call it. And it goes through that biofiltration swale system until it's decontaminated before it goes into anything else in your garden, right? So we have a physical defense, physical barrier that is protecting any inflow of rain. The second is wind. If you are in an area where the wind is blowing onto your property, you need to be very aware of when they're spraying. I was hitchhiking to the New Farmers gathering in Nova Scotia many moons ago, and I was picked up by a guy who worked in the paramedics, and he had been there for over 30 years, and he was actually in the administration. And I was going to Wolfville, which is where the conference was, and he was asking me a lot of questions. Like, when people ask you questions and there's clearly a motive, they're like going to something with it. And so finally, he was trying to ascertain whether I was moving there, because I was fairly young at that age, because he wanted to warn me to not move there if I planned on having children, because they noticed that the miscarriage rates were significantly higher in the growing valleys immediately after they sprayed for the apples or the grapes. So within the weeks after they spray, miscarriage rates were up really high. he then told me, because I was like, well, that's amazing data. Why don't you have this published? And he said, well, we gathered all of the data on our time as paramedics, and the government of Canada, Health Canada, uh, basically grabbed all that data and forbade us from using it and publishing it. And so last I talked to him, which was over 20 years ago now, he said that they were gathering it on their own free time so that they could independently publish, because basically Health Canada didn't want that knowledge getting out that the sprays put on these orchards caused increased miscarriage rate, because then obviously we wouldn't allow these chemicals to be put on our food. So the wind, and basically where my tangent is coming back to, is that that's just the spraying drifting off the trees when it's windy out. Now, even when it's not windy, onto the neighboring houses and the neighboring families that are living there, and causing miscarriages through inhalation or other means of exposure, or maybe it's in the water. But if it's directly within the weeks after a spray, it's most likely wind exposure. So what you want is you want to have a wind break that is going to be blocking any of the potential wind from coming to your property. Hopefully, if you haven't built yet, you don't build near the property lines of your actual piece of land, but you're building more in the central area. And if not, then you do that. The next thing is to implement a HEPA filter system on your home. One of the things that I think I love about a Tesla car is the fact that you can be in a chemical war attack and be in the car, and it completely protects you because it has such a high filtration level. So why don't we have these kind of basic things on our homes, right? If there's a forest fire outside, we shouldn't smell smoke inside. This is something we should be able to attain nowadays. So having a proper HEPA filter system on your intake and your air circulation in your home, so that if you notice that there are spraying planes out there, that you can stay indoors and close up the windows and have that filtration system to protect you during that duration. So those are the immediate short terms, and then the long terms are to get involved with the local community groups that are opposed to the spraying near residential areas and the use of these chemicals, to share and repost and sign the petitions about all the Roundup that's coming out. If we heard about that the janitor who worked at the school who got $300 million from Monsanto before they were bought by Bayer, because of all the cancer that they proved he got from their product. And then all of a sudden, we didn't really hear much about Monsanto Roundup cancer anymore. But there's been hundreds and hundreds of more cases that have been brought to court and settled by Monsanto. And every time they settle one of these cases, is they're admitting to the fact that it is absolutely a carcinogen. So we need to bring that up into our local communities. When we sit around and think that our municipalities are going to do everything for us, we haven't worked with or known somebody who works in the municipality. Because if you think about how many pots they have on the stove, they're tending to the pots that are boiling over, right? So a lot of them are very open and very interested in a lot of the things that you're interested in, but they either don't have the support, or they don't have the direct cry out from the citizens, or it's fallen to the wayside because they're focusing on roads and health and pandemic and everything else. So we need to be the squeaky wheels. Once we've taken care of our own in-house protection, we need to start making sure that this stuff isn't no longer allowed to be on the other side of the fence. Okay, hold on. So where do we get? Sarah, has that?
All the questions have been answered.
Okay, I think this.
10 to 15 minutes left.
There's another one that came in on YouTube. Genghis Khan want to install a water captation system in Montreal on a flat roof. I calculated that that it will capture 54,000 liters of water per year. How many 1,000 liter tanks should I install if I want to use this water for gardening? So first of all, the roofs in our homes are going to capture way more water than you'll ever need for the garden. What you want to think about is, and this starts with start small, right? One of the permaculture principles: start small and slow solutions. Set up 1,000 liter tank, put it on one of your gutters, and put the timer on for your drip irrigation. I do 2 hours every second night, or if you buy the fancy drip irrigation timer, you can actually have a rain delay, so it senses when there was rain and then it won't do the next irrigation. If you do that one, you'll have the most efficient use of water. And calculate how long it takes for you to drain the 1,000 liters, and then extrapolate that to the growing months of the season. That's going to be a lot better way of calculating how much rainwater you want. So that's a baseline of how much you will use. And then you're going to look at, instead of looking at the annual rainfall, which is the 54,000 liters of water, look at how much rainfall we get on average in those growing season, in the growing months, because your tanks are going to be refilling, right? It's not like you need to catch it all and then drain it all. There is a period of refill. And what I like to do on all of my rain garden systems to have them fully automated is that we have a float valve that is connected to a tap from the house. And on that tap, I have an inline filter, so that filters out any of the chlorines or medical waste or whatever else is in our drinking water. And so that if ever the tank is at complete empty, it will refill at least from our municipal supply of water that's gone through one of our inline filters. So you kind of set up a fail safe so that even if, because you can calculate all you want, but like 2 years ago, we got 30% less rain in the summer than normal, right? So that means you would be short if you had just calculated based on how much it should refill. So it's not always going to be like that. So just, you always want you want redundancy in your system. So if the rains don't come, you have a backup system, and you're not all of a sudden spraying by hand all night long chlorinated, fluoridated water onto your garden. You've got it set up to your drip line system so that it takes care of itself if ever you come to that point. Okay, I guess I hope that answers your question. All right, we have 10 minutes left. So we are doing an introduction to permaculture, which is going to go a lot more into some of these elements like dripline irrigation, living soil, water management, and all of these different aspects. It's on the 18th of January, Tuesday, from 7:30 till 9 p.m. So feel free to join us there. We're going to go a lot more in depth, and there's also going to be slideshows with visuals and examples of all of what we're doing. If you really are interested in getting into this in a lot more depth, then I highly recommend coming to one of our courses. We have on our website, we have online courses that are set up for ecological gardening, for urban permaculture specific. So Monique, there's a lot of more urban elements there, like vermicomposting, self-watering garden bins, and so on there in more detail. We also have other more advanced, so it's kind of an intermediate course, which is the Permaculture Fundamentals course. This is a 30-hour online course that goes through the design tools. So if you really want to be using these design tools to help redesign your yard, to help design your home, and so on, but you're not ready to take the full 100-hour certification course, but you want to get somewhere, get going now, the fundamentals course is a really great way to do that and get started. And then for those who want to do the deep dive with us and go into the 100-hour course where we do huge amounts of design work with different scales, different problems, and actually complete the course with a real design for a real client, those, we have one that's a part-time course that's being run here at the Artist Co-op, the Fab, here in Chelsea in the spring over 5 weekends. And then we have one that's a 2-week intensive that is run at the Alpaca Permaculture Farm in Wakefield in July. So those are 2 opportunities to get more in depth with us. Also, feel free to just send us questions if you have questions, knowing that right now I am also my son's caregiver during the day and working at night. So the questions sometimes take a little bit of time for me to get to, depending on whether I can get enough work done in the evenings or not. But if you send us an email with your questions, we'll definitely get to them eventually. So it's really been a pleasure. If other people have questions that have come up that you want us to ask, feel free to send them along, and we can do our best to get you some resources. And if anyone wants to know more about our courses and stay up to date with what we're doing and what we're offering, go to our homepage at p3permaculture.ca and sign up to our newsletter. And we do not send out multiple newsletters a month or a week or a day like some people do, but we get basically one a month. And if we have nothing to say, we won't be sending it. So we'll mainly be letting you know when there's new courses that are available, when there's large events that are happening, or other things like that that are going on. So sign up there and stay connected with us. And if you also join either our Facebook, if you're on Facebook, then you can also stay connected through that. But it's been a pleasure. I'm really glad everyone jumped in. I'm glad the double, triple streaming worked for us, and had some good questions today. It's always nice to reach out and connect with other people that are facing all of these difficulties and world-changing perspectives together. As someone who's been doing it and teaching it for many, 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 many years, sometimes designing at night for one client can feel really lonesome. So really appreciate everyone being there. I really appreciate everyone jumping on the live streams. And I think this was definitely more of a success than I thought it would be. So we'll be doing this more often. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your contributions. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank
Thanks, François.
Nice to see you, Graham.
Yeah, you too, Joan. Take care.
Thank you, John.
Bye.